There are moments in music history when a single groove can lift an entire room off the ground. Before anyone knew their name, the Commodores were the kind of band that could turn a campus party into a memory people carried for life. Their sound was raw, joyful, and full of the wide-eyed energy that came from a group of young men who never imagined their late nights at Tuskegee would one day shake the world of Motown. As time moved forward, the world began to look back on the Floaters with a different kind of appreciation. Their story, once overshadowed by industry labels and shifting musical trends, slowly gained clarity as listeners and historians revisited the era they helped shape. What had once been dismissed as a one-hit moment now revealed itself as something deeper, something rooted in authenticity and cultural resonance. Long before the Commodores became one of Motown's most powerful forces, their story began in a place far removed from bright lights or hit records. The late 1960 decade at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama was full of movement, ambition, and the kind of youthful energy that makes anything feel possible. As time moved forward, the world began to look back on the Floaters with a different kind of appreciation. Their story, once overshadowed by industry labels and shifting musical trends, slowly gained clarity as listeners and historians revisited the era they helped shape. What had once been dismissed as a one-hit moment now revealed itself as something deeper, something rooted in authenticity and cultural resonance. Both were made up of students who studied by day and played music at night, not to chase fame but because it made them feel alive. The members included William King, Thomas McClary, Ronald LaPred, Walter Orange, Lionel Richie, and Milan Williams. Some were natural musicians, others were still learning, but all shared the same desire to perform, have fun, and bring people together. What brought these students into the same room wasn't ambition or strategy, but a simple realization: they had more fun playing together than apart. The two groups gradually merged into one, unified by friendship and the thrill of creating something new. They began rehearsing in dorm lounges, student centers, and anywhere they could find an outlet for their instruments. At this point, they were just college kids trying to make each other laugh, trying to impress girls, and trying to see how far they could go with a little rhythm and a lot of heart. When it came time to choose a name, the group joked, debated, and argued themselves into exhaustion. Nothing felt right. Finally, Walter Orange handed William King a dictionary and told him to pick a word at random. King flipped the pages, pointed, and landed on a single word: Commodore. It had authority, weight. Both were made up of students who studied by day and played music at night, not to chase fame but because it made them feel alive. The members included William King, Thomas McClary, Ronald LaPred, Walter Orange, Lionel Richie, and Milan Williams. Some were natural musicians, others were still learning, but all shared the same desire to perform, have fun, and bring people together. Every night taught them how to communicate without speaking, how to blend their individual talents into one unified groove. Their reputation spread quickly across Tuskegee, then across nearby Montgomery and Birmingham. They won the campus talent show with ease, not because they were polished professionals, but because they played with joy and sincerity. Students talked about their shows for days afterward. People who had never been interested in funk or R&B found themselves drawn to the energy the group brought to the stage. By 1969, their confidence had grown, and the group decided to take a risk. They traveled to New York to perform at Small's Paradise, a historic Harlem club known for launching careers. But when they arrived, the owner wasn't convinced they were worth booking. He turned them down at first, only to call them back when another act canceled. The Commodores knew this was their chance. They pulled off a clever move. They filled the club with friends and supporters, so the room would erupt the minute they began to play. The owner, unaware of the trick, believed he had discovered a group capable of shaking the entire building. He was impressed enough to book more shows. That moment marked their first real break. It was in Harlem that they met Benny Ashburn, the man who would become their manager and one of the most important figures in their rise. Ashburn saw past their youth and rawness. He saw discipline, chemistry, and potential. He recognized that the Commodores weren't just a college band with a good groove. They had the ability to take over a room, to win over a crowd, to make people care about their music. He believed in them enough to push for a record deal. Ashburn eventually connected the group with Atlantic Records. But while the opportunity looked promising, their early recordings failed to make an impact. Yet even this setback became a part of their formation. They learned what it meant to record professionally, to navigate the industry, and, most importantly, to trust their instincts. The Commodores were still students then, carrying textbooks in one hand and instruments in the other. But everything they experienced during those early years, the small stages, the loud crowds, the late-night rehearsals, the New York gamble, prepared them for the moment that would change everything, the moment Motown called. Their journey had begun not with fame, but with friendship and courage. And as they stepped into the next chapter, they had no idea how far those qualities would take them. When the Commodores returned from New York with a manager who believed in them, they were no longer just a campus band with a clever name. They were beginning to step into the wider world of the music industry, where talent alone wasn't enough. Benny Ashburn, sharp and business-minded, became the anchor that helped transform their raw potential into something focused and powerful. He worked tirelessly to get them in front of the right people, and one of those opportunities came through Atlantic Records. Their time with Atlantic was brief and ultimately unsuccessful, but it served as an important lesson. Recording in a professional environment forced the group to confront what separated live performers from recording artists. On stage, the Commodores had undeniable chemistry, their groove-filled rooms and electrified audiences. In the studio, however, that energy needed to be shaped, refined, and directed. Their recordings lacked the spark that made them magnetic on stage, and the label didn't hear what they needed to hear. But instead of breaking their spirit, the experience hardened their resolve. Meanwhile, Ashburn wasn't finished searching for the perfect home for them. His connections led him to Susan DePass, a Motown executive with a reputation for recognizing talent before the rest of the industry did. Motown was a dream for almost any young group then. It represented opportunity, prestige, and the chance to join a legacy of artists who had defined the sound of modern black music. But Motown didn't sign artists out of hope. They signed artists out of certainty. DePass needed to see the group in action. The chance came when Motown needed an opening act for one of the biggest sensations of the era, the Jackson 5. DePass recommended the Commodores for the gig, and the group stepped onto a stage far larger than anything they had ever experienced. Night after night, they were tasked with warming up crowds who came primarily to see superstars. For most bands, this would have been intimidating. For the Commodores, it was fuel. They performed with intensity, confidence, and an instinctive ability to lift the energy of an entire arena. It didn't take long for Motown to notice what audiences already felt. The Commodores were not just good entertainers. They were professionals who could adapt, compete, and elevate any stage they touched. Their success as an opening act led directly to a Motown contract, the moment that would redirect the trajectory of their lives forever. But even with the contract in place, their early years at Motown were far from easy. The members were still in college, juggling classes, travel, rehearsals, and studio sessions. The strain was immense. Motown demanded excellence, and the Commodores were determined not to fall short. They split their time between their education and their growing career, knowing that they were standing on the edge of something extraordinary. Once they graduated from Tuskegee in 1974, they were finally able to give their careers their full attention. And their first official statement under Motown, the album Machine Gun, showed the world exactly what happened when 6 disciplined, hungry young musicians put everything they had into a single project. That album didn't just mark their arrival. It announced it with the force of a bass line that refused to be ignored. The release of Machine Gun in 1974 was more than a successful debut. It was the moment the Commodores discovered who they truly were as recording artists. The title track, an explosive instrumental driven by Milan Williams's lightning-fast keyboard lines, immediately set them apart from every other act at Motown. Machine Gun didn't flirt with funk, it attacked it head-on. Stadiums and sporting events across the country embraced the track, and suddenly, the Commodores weren't just another new signing, they were a band with a sound sharp enough to carve out their own lane. The success of their debut pushed Motown to invest in them as a priority act, and with that support came the chance to build on the momentum they had already created. But what really made the Commodores special during these years wasn't just their musicianship, it was their versatility. While many funk bands thrived on groove alone, the Commodores balanced that energy with a surprising emotional depth. And at the center of that softer side was Lionel Richie. Richie had been writing melodies since his early college years, but the world had not yet heard what he was capable of. When he began bringing his ballads to the group, something extraordinary happened. The Commodores discovered they could reach audiences not only through high-energy funk, but through heartfelt storytelling. Songs like Sweet Love and Just to Be Close to You showcased Richie's warm, tender writing style, while still allowing the group's harmonies and instrumental finesse to shine. Between 1975 and 1979, the Commodores entered a creative stretch that few bands in the era could match. They released 6 albums during this period, 4 of which went platinum and 1 that went gold. Each album offered a blend of punchy, dance-driven funk and soulful, emotional ballads. This dual identity gave them a unique advantage. They appealed to fans who wanted to dance and fans who wanted to feel. The hits stacked up quickly. Slippery. When Wet became a fan favorite, pairing humor with funk in a way that only they could deliver. Just to Be Close to You revealed the emotional intimacy that Lionel Richie brought to the group. Easy became a monumental crossover hit, reaching listeners across multiple genres and proving that the Commodores could move beyond funk without losing their identity. And then came Brick House, a song so iconic, so distinctly theirs, that it remains one of the defining funk anthems of the entire decade. By the late 1970 decade, the Commodores were no longer simply a promising Motown act. They were one of the label's most valuable groups, carrying the torch at a time when Motown was transitioning into a new era. Their live performances grew larger, more dynamic, and more theatrical. Each member contributed in his own way, forming a collective greater than the sum of its parts. But even as the group soared higher, subtle shifts were beginning to form beneath the surface. The media's attention increasingly gravitated toward Lionel Richie, whose songwriting and vocal presence had become essential to their biggest hits. Interviews, press coverage, and industry praise focused more and more on Richie, creating an imbalance that would eventually grow too large to ignore. For now, though, the Commodores were in full bloom. They had found their voice, their audience, and their place in the evolving landscape of American music, and the world was listening. By the time the late 1970 decade arrived, the Commodores had moved far beyond their beginnings as a college band searching for a stage. They had become a musical force, a group whose presence on the radio, on television, and in arenas across the world was impossible to ignore. Their combination of raw funk power and elegant balladry created a unique identity that carried them to the height of their career. And at its peak, the Commodores were not simply successful, they were everywhere. Motown, recognizing the magnitude of the moment, positioned the Commodores as one of the label's primary acts. With the Jackson 5 moving in a new direction and other major artists exploring independent paths, the Commodores stepped into the spotlight at exactly the right time. They had the musicianship, the charisma, and the versatility to lead the label into a new era. More importantly, they had built a bond with audiences who saw themselves reflected in the group's sincerity and emotional honesty. Their albums during this period were not just popular. They were cultural events. Heroes and In the Pocket soared up the charts, continuing a pattern of platinum success that few bands could sustain. Each release reminded the world that the Commodores understood the delicate balance between rhythm and emotion. They could make you dance until your feet ached, or they could stop you cold with a lyric that felt pulled from your own life. Their concerts grew into full-scale productions. The stage lights hit the sequined costumes. Walter Orange attacked the drums with a fire that drove the heart of their funk sound. Milan Williams brought shimmering keys that filled the air like a second voice. Ronald LaPred anchored the music with deep, commanding bass lines. Thomas McClary let his guitar cry, bark, and soar. William King added horn textures that made the band feel even bigger. And at the center of it all stood Lionel Richie, whose soft, warm voice connected instantly with audiences. Songs from this era became part of the American soundtrack. Brick House exploded from speakers with a confidence that made it one of the most recognizable funk anthems ever recorded. Easy blended soul and pop with such smoothness that it crossed genres without hesitation. 3 Times a Lady felt like a quiet confession, a song so intimate that it turned arenas into a room where everyone was remembering someone they once loved. still reinforced Ritchie's ability to take a simple emotion and elevate it into something universal. The Commodores achieved something rare during their peak. They appealed to fans across generations. Young listeners danced to their funk, while older fans embraced the softer, heartfelt ballads. Couples adopted their songs as part of their love stories. Radio stations relied on them for both energy and emotion. They had become a group that could unify an audience simply by stepping on stage. And in these years, the Commodores were more than entertainers. They were a symbol of what music could be when talent, timing, and truth aligned. They had climbed from college gigs to the world stage, and for a moment, it felt as though nothing could touch them. But even at their highest point, change was slowly making its way toward them. The spotlight that once shined on the group as a whole began turning more heavily toward one man. And that shift, quiet at first, would eventually change everything. At the height of their success, when the world seemed to move to the rhythm of their music, subtle cracks began forming within the Commodores. These weren't dramatic explosions or public conflicts. They were quiet shifts, the kind that start small and grow silently until they can no longer be ignored. And for this group, those early signs took shape around the growing spotlight focused on Lionel Richie. Lionel had always been a gifted songwriter, but by the late 1970 decade, his ballads were reshaping the identity of the group. Songs like 3 Times a Lady and still carried a tenderness that audiences connected with deeply. Radio stations requested him, interviewers leaned toward him, magazine covers wanted him. The more attention he received, the more unbalanced the group dynamic began to feel. It wasn't Lionel's fault, but fame isn't something a band can divide evenly, no matter how close they are. Interviews became awkward. Journalists asked questions directly to Lionel, even when the entire group sat beside him. Headlines highlighted his voice, his charm, his writing. It wasn't long before the public began to think of the Commodores not as a unified band, but as a great band with a star emerging at the center. The other members felt the shift. They supported Lionel, but they also felt themselves disappearing beneath the weight of his growing fame. Then came a moment that changed everything. Endless Love. The duet with Diana Ross in 1980, became one of the most successful singles of the decade. But behind the scenes, it sent a tremor through the group. If Lionel could achieve that level of success outside the band, what did that mean for their future together? As these tensions simmered, another blow struck with heartbreaking force. Benny Ashburn, the group's longtime manager and the man who had guided their career from the beginning, passed away from a heart attack at the age of 54. His loss left the group without the anchor who had kept them grounded and unified through years of touring, recording, and fame. Without Benny, the internal balance shifted even further. Lionel's departure soon followed. He decided to pursue a solo career, encouraged by Motown and by the momentum he had built. His exit wasn't angry or messy, but it was painful. The band had started as brothers. Losing such a central member felt like losing a vital limb. With Richie gone and their guiding manager gone, the Commodores stood at a crossroads. They were still talented, still respected, but the foundation that once made them unshakable had been weakened. And the quiet seeds that had once seemed insignificant were now fully in bloom, revealing challenges they could no longer avoid. The early 1980 decade found the Commodores standing in a place they had never imagined. They were a band at the height of global fame, yet internally, they were navigating the deepest uncertainty of their career. Lionel Richie had left to pursue his solo path, and the loss of Benny Ashburn still weighed heavily on them. Their world had shifted, and while they remained determined to continue, the reality was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. The absence of Lionel created a void much larger than a missing voice. It affected their chemistry, their creative process, and their identity. Richie had become the emotional center of their ballads, the writer of their biggest crossover hits, the figure the media gravitated toward. Without him, the group faced a difficult question. What version of the Commodores existed now? The band brought in Skylar Jett to help fill the vocal space Richie left behind, but it was not an easy transition. Lionel Richie's tone, phrasing, and gentle warmth were not things that could be imitated. Even though Jett was talented, audiences had become deeply attached to the familiar voice that carried so many of the group's ballads. That emotional bond was hard to replace. Meanwhile, the music industry around them was changing rapidly. Funk no longer dominated the airwaves the way it once had. Pop was evolving. New wave, synth-driven production, and the rise of MTV created a landscape that demanded reinvention. The Commodores, once trendsetters, now faced a world that wanted a different sound. They attempted to adapt. Their 1983 release, Commodores 13, tried to explore new directions, but the album struggled to find its footing. It peaked modestly on the charts, and the reaction made it painfully clear that audiences were adjusting to the band's new identity just as slowly as the band itself. In the midst of this, guitarist Thomas McClary departed to pursue his own solo career. Another loss that chipped away at the musical foundation they had built together since their days at Tuskegee. The departures didn't stop there. Sheldon Reynolds, who stepped into the guitarist role, eventually left as well, moving on to join Earth, Wind, and Fire. Each change created another ripple, another reminder that the group who once operated like a tight-knit family was now trying to move forward with an ever-changing lineup. On top of the internal instability, the pressure to produce hits weighed heavily on them. They were a platinum-selling group, a Motown powerhouse. Expectations didn't disappear simply because the circumstances had changed. But without the chemistry and consistency of their earlier years, every recording session carried the weight of living up to a legacy they were struggling to hold on to. The media, which once celebrated them, now turned the spotlight toward Lionel Richie's meteoric solo success. His rise was extraordinary, and deservedly so, but the comparisons were unfair. The Commodores were fighting to redefine themselves while the world watched their former bandmate climb to new heights. It created a narrative the group could not control, and the emotional toll of that shadow grew heavier with time. Yet through all of this, they stayed on the road. They kept touring, they kept performing, because for them, music was not only a career, it was the bond that had brought them together as young men. Even if the world around them changed, they believed their story wasn't finished. But belief alone could not erase the storm gathering around them. The cracks that formed during their peak were widening, and the challenges ahead would push the Commodores into a chapter defined not by triumph, but by resilience. As the 1980 decade continued, the weight of every change, every departure, and every shift in the industry finally began to show. For the first time since their rise, the Commodores found themselves in unfamiliar territory. The hits that once came naturally now felt distant. The charts, once a familiar home, became harder to reach. And the steady applause that had followed them around the world was quieter than it had ever been. Without Lionel Richie, the group faced a challenge that went beyond talent. They were fighting against sentiment. Fans associated certain songs, certain emotions, and certain memories with Richie's voice. Even when the band delivered strong performances with new vocalists, the audience measured them against a version of the Commodores that no longer existed. It was an impossible comparison, and one that weighed heavily on every new release. Thomas McClary's departure removed another pillar of their sound. His guitar work had been a defining force since the beginning, and losing him created a gap in both the music and the spirit of the group. Sheldon Reynolds, who stepped in briefly, brought undeniable skill, but the lineup continued to shift. Stability became a luxury the group no longer had. By the time they released Commodores 13, the commercial and emotional strain was clear. The album charted, but without the power or presence of their earlier work. Critics labeled it transitional, a polite way of saying that the group was searching for direction, and they were. They were musicians trying to carry a legacy while rebuilding themselves from the inside out. Yet even in this challenging period, a single spark of light emerged. The release of Night Shift in 1985 marked a moment of unexpected revival. The song, a tribute to Marvin Gaye and Jackie Wilson, carried genuine emotion and resonated deeply with listeners. It became their first Grammy-winning song, proof that the Commodores still had something meaningful to offer the world. It was a reminder of their resilience, their history, and the heart that had carried them since Tuskegee. But one song, even a great one, could not fully stop the tide. The industry had moved into a new era. MTV dominated. Synth-driven production reshaped pop and R&B. Bands had to reinvent themselves faster than ever, and the Commodores were still adjusting to the losses that had reshaped their identity. With each passing year, the group faced the quiet consequence of longevity. The world changes, whether you change with it or not. Lineups shifted, musical styles evolved, and the Commodores, once a unified force, now operated more like survivors of a storm, holding on to the pieces of what they had built. Still, through every obstacle, they refused to disappear. They kept touring. They kept recording. They kept honoring the music that had carried them from a college campus to international stages. And in that determination, there was dignity, a reminder that even when the spotlight fades, the soul of a band can keep beating. The release of Night Shift in 1985 marked a moment of unexpected revival. The song, a tribute to Marvin Gaye and Jackie Wilson, carried genuine emotion and resonated deeply with listeners. It became their first Grammy-winning song, proof that the Commodores still had something meaningful to offer the world. It was a reminder of their resilience, their history, and the heart that had carried them since Tuskegee. But one song, even a great one, could not fully stop the tide. They shaped multiple corners of black music and left fingerprints on genres that didn't even exist when they first began. At the heart of their American legacy was versatility. Few groups could shift from muscular, high-energy tracks like Brick House to soft, reflective ballads such as Easy and Still. This ability connected them with an enormous range of listeners. Families played their funk at reunions and celebrations. Couples chose their ballads for weddings, anniversaries, and quiet car rides home. Their music wove itself into daily life, marking memories in ways that lasted long after trends faded. Their contributions also had a lasting impact on the evolution of R&B and contemporary pop. Many artists in the decades that followed studied the Commodores not only for their musical skill but for their emotional honesty. Lionel Richie's writing style became a blueprint for countless songwriters. By the time the 1980 decade moved into its later years, the Commodores had already secured a place within the emotional history of American music. Even as commercial momentum slowed, their influence continued to grow in quieter, deeper ways. Their catalog, shaped by both unstoppable funk and tender ballads, became a reminder of how dynamic a single group could be. The Commodores didn't define just one sound. Lines, riffs, and drum patterns resurfaced in new songs, proving that their influence stretched beyond their original era. Sampling wasn't just a technical choice. It was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement that their work captured something timeless. Globally, their impact was just as powerful. The Commodores enjoyed a devoted international fan base, particularly in Europe, where audiences embraced both their funk-driven energy and their romantic ballads. Tours across the United Kingdom, Germany, and other parts of Europe continued to draw large crowds, even during periods when their chart presence in the United States had slowed. European listeners didn't view the Commodores as a nostalgic act. They saw them as a foundational part of modern soul and R&B. Their legacy also expanded through Lionel Richie's solo career, which carried elements of the Commodores' emotional DNA into global pop. Even when Richie's success placed him in a different spotlight, the roots of his songwriting came from the years he spent shaping the sound of the group. His rise didn't overshadow the Commodores' contributions. Instead, it underscored the depth of artistry that came from their early chemistry. Through it all, one truth became clear. The Commodores made music that lasted. Their songs were not built for a moment. They were built for memory. They continue to echo through generations, each decade finding new listeners who discovered just how much soul, power, and humanity lived inside every note. The evolution of American music cannot be told without acknowledging them, and the emotional history of countless fans would be incomplete without the songs the Commodores left behind. As the years moved forward, something remarkable happened with the Commodores. Even as the charts shifted and new genres rose to prominence, their music refused to disappear. Instead, it settled into a new place within the hearts of listeners across the world, a place where nostalgia and deep respect blended together. Time has a way of deciding which artists belong to history and which artists belong to memory. The Commodores, in the end, belonged to both. In the United States, their legacy became woven into the cultural fabric of everyday life. Brick House remained a permanent fixture at celebrations, sports arenas, and family gatherings. Easy and Three Times a Lady found new life at weddings, anniversaries, and quiet late-night radio programs that celebrated classic soul. Generations who grew up with their music passed it down to their children, not as old songs, but as personal treasures. In living rooms and car rides across the country, the Commodores stayed alive through the moments they helped people feel. Outside of America, their legacy took on an even broader shape. In Europe, especially in the United Kingdom, the Commodores never stopped being a beloved touring act. Their concerts drew audiences who treated them not as a memory from the past, but as living legends. Their blend of funk, soul, and heartfelt balladry resonated deeply with international listeners who valued the richness of live musicianship. While the American industry moved through phases of trends and reinvention, European fans held fast, preserving their admiration with a loyalty that lasted decades. Formal recognition eventually followed. In 1995, the Commodores were inducted into the Alabama Music Hall of Fame, a tribute to the place that shaped their early identity. In 2003, they entered the Vocal Group Hall of Fame, standing alongside the great ensembles that helped define the sound of modern American music. These honors acknowledged what millions of listeners already knew. Their impact was profound, and their contributions deserved a permanent place in music history. What makes their legacy so meaningful today is not simply the success they achieved, but the endurance of their spirit. The Commodores survived changes that would have ended most groups. They adapted, rebuilt, and continued to perform for audiences who needed the comfort, joy, and energy their music brought. They endured because their songs carried a sincerity that trends could never replace. For fans around the world, the Commodores are remembered not as a band that faded, but as a band that lived long enough to be rediscovered by each new generation. And that, perhaps, is the greatest measure of a legacy. The way the music continues to find its way back into the lives of people who were not even born when the first notes were played. Looking back on the journey of the Commodores, it becomes clear that their story was never just about a string of hits or a moment in the spotlight. It was about 6 young men who came together at Tuskegee, with nothing more than talent, friendship, and a desire to make music that felt honest. It was about the courage to rise, the humility to adapt, and the dignity to keep going even when the world shifted around them. Their path was full of triumphs that reshaped the landscape of funk and soul. Machine Gun, Brick House, Easy, Three Times a Lady, Still, and so many others became markers in people's lives, songs that captured joy, heartbreak, celebration, and reflection. At their peak, they were unstoppable, a band whose grooves filled arenas and whose ballads touched the quietest corners of the heart. But what makes their story truly powerful is the way they carried themselves through the harder chapters. They faced the loss of their manager, the departure of Lionel Richie, the weight of changing trends, and the challenge of rebuilding their identity again and again. Many groups would have folded under that kind of pressure. The Commodores did not. They kept performing, they kept recording, they kept showing up for the audiences who still believed in them. And in doing so, they proved that legacy is not just what you achieve when the world is watching. Legacy is what remains when the applause fades, when the spotlight moves on, when the world changes and you choose to keep going anyway. Their music continued to live in weddings, reunions, radio playlists, and generations of new listeners discovering them for the first time. Their songs were not just popular, they were woven into the emotional history of millions. Today, the Commodores stand as more than a Motown success story. They are a reminder of what happens when talent meets heart, when friendship meets perseverance, and when a group refuses to let the moment define the meaning of their art. Their journey wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and that is why it still matters. Do you think the Commodores ever received the full respect they deserved? If their story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to help preserve the memory of artists who shaped the soundtrack of our lives, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories from Celebrity Underrated.